In this podcast, I'm going to be addressing some of the issues surrounding the context of Blood Brothers. But before I do that, I just want to mention very briefly what we mean by context and what it's for and why we talk about it to begin with. So context provides us with our frame of reference. It's often historical. It can go beyond that. It can be social context, cultural context, religious context. There's lots of different kinds of context, but it explains why characters behave in a certain way. So a character who lives in a very religious environment is going to have their behavior dictated by that religious context. Maybe they accept it, maybe they reject it. Either way, they're acting in accordance with the context. So understanding context can help us understand why characters do what they do, or why they avoid doing certain actions. And some things are so specific that they can only be explained through reference to context. And if it wasn't for context, their behaviour would be baffling, completely inexplicable. And the important thing to remember when you're writing about it and when you're incorporating context into essays is that it's not a box-ticking exercise. We don't want you just sticking in a historical fact because you think there has to be one there and just leave it be. The context needs to be there to help you interpret what the characters are doing and why the characters are doing it. Now what I'm going to do is run through some of the various contextual points that crop up when we're talking about Blood Brothers. And the first one I'm going to mention, just because it happens to come up early on in the play, is the figure of Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe, obviously, is one of the great icons and sex symbols of the mid-20th century. She, to somebody who was living in the 1950s or early 1960s, is the ultimate example of feminine sex appeal. But at the same time, there's a very dark side to Marilyn Monroe. She was extremely vulnerable. She was manipulated. She had a lot of personal problems which culminated in a very early death at around about the time that Mickey and Edward would have been born in the story. And it's that combination of outward success and inner troubles that makes her such an appropriate image to bring up in Blood Brothers. The comparison with Marilyn Monroe is not entirely flattering. It is at first glance. It appears superficially flattering. But then along with that, there's all the baggage that comes with her. This combination of outward success and outward beauty with great trouble. And so when characters talk about being sexier than Marilyn Monroe, they are suggesting a darker outcome than perhaps they realise, which is appropriate given the plot of Blood Brothers ultimately, but the characters don't necessarily know that when they're talking about it. But Marilyn Monroe is an image that comes and goes through the play, and the contextual issues that really matter in terms of defining who these characters are and how they interact and why they turn out like they do are class, money, and education. And I just want to deal with education first so that we can continue to track the characters from the beginning of the play through to the end. So, Blood Brothers sees our two tragic characters, Mickey and Edward, grow up in the 70s and then into the 80s. And this is a time where the British education system is split selectively. You've got grammar schools on the one side, and then you've got secondary moderns on the other. Private schools are slightly different. I'm mostly talking about the state sector here. Grammar schools were academic. Students who attended them would sit O-levels, and they were designed to set students up for higher education. A-levels, degrees. By contrast, you also had secondary modern schools, which were more vocational and technical. The idea with these was to set students up to enter the workforce directly after leaving schools. CSEs tended to be less rigorous, less complex, and less valuable in terms of setting people up for higher education. Passing CSEs, for example, would not qualify you to do A-levels. You would have to do a separate conversion course before you could do A-levels on the basis of CSEs. And it was quite common for students to leave school at the age of 15 or 16 with no qualifications at all. And the difference, the factor that decided which one a state sector student would go through, was the 11 plus exam, taken at the end of primary school, which would decide whether or not you would go to grammar school or a secondary modern. Someone who went to a secondary modern would not necessarily have expectations of going to higher education, of going to university, which was relatively rare in the 1970s compared with how it is now. And the important thing to note is that passing the 11 plus and therefore getting into a grammar school is highly correlated with social class, and it only ever applied to a minority of students. In the 1970s, even into the late 1970s, only about a third of school-age students took an O-level in maths. The bulk of school-age students took a CSE in maths, and a handful of students didn't take any qualification in maths at all. So O-levels are relatively rare. Now, if we look at the scene where Mickey gets kicked out of school for having an argument with his teacher about some seemingly obscure and irrelevant point of geography, this scene makes a little bit more sense within this context. Mickey is cynical towards his school, he's cynical towards his teachers who don't seem to be very interested in the students, don't seem to like them very much. But the important thing to notice here is that Mickey isn't just cynical towards his one teacher and his one school. We need to be thinking about this in terms of the British school system in general. By the time Mickey is old enough to be having this kind of conversation, because remember this comes slightly later in the play, he is well aware what his expectations are. He knows he's not going to go to university. He knows that his future holds a low-paid, low-skilled job that does not require an academic education. So why would he care? Edward also resents school, but it's not quite the same thing with him, because for all the trouble he gets into swearing at his teacher, he doesn't really suffer any consequences. He still gets the benefit of his education. He goes to university, and at the end of the play we see that he's entering a career in politics. So the trouble he's got into doesn't seem to have affected him in any meaningful sense. So while it looks like the scenes are paralleled and the play structures it so that we see one straight after the other, the comparisons aren't quite as neat and tidy as they perhaps look. And education leads on to employment, and this is where class comes into play again. So one of the ways we can define social class is through resources and labour and who owns what. So Mrs. Johnston, for example, she's working class. She sells her labour to earn a crust. She goes out and cleans other people's houses. It's her work to pay her bills. The Lyons family is middle class because they are the owners. They own the resources. Mrs. Lyons has the money to buy Mrs. Johnston's labour. And later, Mr. Lyons has the money to pay for Mickey's labour in the factory. And the key thing here is that low-skilled working-class jobs are inherently vulnerable, more so than high-skilled jobs. In the 1980s, which is where the play ends, we're talking about hard-up communities with lots of poverty and lots of unemployment, and it's the low-skilled workers who are first to lose their job. Edward and Mr. Lyons never really suffer financially, but they do cause financial suffering in others. So let's have a think about characters' attitudes towards money. There's lots of different examples of this. The one that I'm sure springs to mind very quickly is Mrs. Johnston, for example, wanting a bike with both wheels on. But I think my favourite example, just because I think it gives us the clearest insight into Mickey and Edward together, is when they're very young and they meet for the first time. And it's the scene with the sweets. Mickey demands a sweet from Edward. Edward agrees straight away. And Mickey responds with shock. Well, why is this? Mickey expects Edward to say no. The reason for that is because to him, a sweet is something valuable. He's poor, so he can't have that many. Edward, on the other hand, has, to all intents and purposes, an infinite supply of sweets. They don't matter. So, yeah, he just says, take as many as you want. It doesn't matter. He can refill his supply of sweets whenever he wants. And it's the shock that gives us the insight into the characters. At this point in the play, Mickey and Edward, they don't understand each other. Mickey doesn't understand what it means to be middle class. Edward doesn't understand what it means to be working class. So they have no frame of reference. And the result is complete bafflement. Edward agreeing to give Mickey a sweet seems to be completely insane behaviour. And this is what I was talking about earlier when I said that some behaviours are so defined by their context that lacking the context makes them impossible to understand. And I think this particular moment with the sweets gives us perhaps the clearest example of how two characters, through their context and through their upbringing, can come up with completely different concepts of what's normal, and will respond with surprise and shock and bewilderment when somebody else comes along who doesn't share that concept of what's normal. Now, I don't want to imply that the middle class stereotypes are always to characters' advantage. They usually are, but sometimes they're not. And there's two important examples, I think, where middle class stereotypes work against middle class characters. The first one is Mrs. Lyons lamenting that she's not able to have a child, and lamenting that Mr. Lyons doesn't want to adopt. And then the second example is much later in the play, where Edward's teacher bullies him, it seems, for his apparent femininity because he carries a locket with him. And I think, although they seem very different and they come at opposite ends of the play, there is an underlying theme in both of these quotations, which is that they express the pressure that middle-class characters are put under to live up to certain stereotypes. Edward has to act like a boy, and Mrs. Lyons has to act like a good wife and provide her husband with a child. And it's that tension between the expectations and their failure to conform to the expectations that can cause some destructive behaviour, much more so with Mrs. Lyons, who ends up threatening Mrs. Johnston with a knife. But this cuts both ways. So you can look at the sequence with the policeman, for example, when he takes Mickey home and then Edward home, and we see that the same action, destructive or not, is treated very differently. Mrs. Johnston is threatened with legal action, whereas in Edward's case it's treated as a harmless prank, and we can clearly see that Mr. Lyons knows exactly how to behave in this kind of situation, offering the policeman a friendly drink. So it is possible to take the same example of behaviour and use context to frame it in different terms, acceptable in one case, unacceptable in the other. Now, as we move towards the end of the play and Mickey's entrance to the workforce, he changes. And there's that wonderful quotation, "I don't wear a hat I could tilt at the world." So Mickey has had a terrible education, but he's not stupid. There is not a correlation between education and intelligence here. He is streetwise and he has a wisdom that Edward lacks. Even if he's very, very simplistic in the way he expresses it, he is showing genuine insight into the class system he's stuck with. Edward, he's had a much better education, but because he hasn't had the kind of pressures and life experiences that Mickey has, is lacking that insight. But, and this is the sting in the tail, that insight that Mickey has doesn't ultimately help him. For all we can talk about his wisdom and his insight and his understanding of the class system, that doesn't help him pay his bills. So we get this moment of character development that is sort of sealed in a bubble, in the sense that we see it exists, but it can't be used to help the character. He can't do anything with the understanding that he's gained. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour through a few of the contextual elements of Blood Brothers. And I just want to finish by giving a couple of tips on how not to write about context. And I've put on the screen here a couple of examples of really bad writing about context. The first one, working class people were badly educated, and middle class people thought they were superior to working class people. Okay, so what's wrong with these? Well, mainly they're massive generalisations. It's certainly true that some working class people were badly educated, but it's not true for all working class people, and it's inappropriate to talk about entire social classes as if they're monolithic, and as if they can all be defined by these broad, simplified statements. And the other problem with these statements is that they're about the context, but they're not about the play. And we need to be thinking about the two, the text and the context, working together. So I'm going to leave you with some suggestions for how to improve. So if we look at the first improvement, working class people were less likely to have a good education. It's still essentially the same point, but it's less general, it's less monolithic, and it shows that there's a social trend without writing off an entire class. The second example relates it to the text. Mickey, as a working class youth, is more vulnerable to social prejudice than Edward. So he gets hammered by the policeman, Edward doesn't. That brings in context and class as a way of explaining an insight into the character. And that is how you talk about context in English literature.